So this session is about the role of government in the free market economy. I'm going to build on some of what Russ Roberts did with you yesterday in a bit more of a quantitative way. We're going to talk about taxes and spending. We're going to talk about what justifies government intervention in the economy and critically assess some of the justifications that are often given for government intervention in the economy. Approximately what percent of the Israeli economy in terms of GDP was government spending in 2021? Okay, this poll should be appearing on your device now. 13%, 23%, 33%, 43%, or 53%. I'm interested in just how much of a free market do we have here? Okay, so let's see. It looks like I can see here 26 of you have responded to this poll so far. That's not bad. 27. Okay, I'd like a few more. I think we're almost there. I don't know. How many total participants do we have here, Hananel? 30? Okay, well, we're doing well. All right, 29. I mean, that's about as good as we're going to get. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to lock it so that you can't change your answer when you see what the majority suggested that other people thought, and I'm going to show the responses. Okay, so here we have the distribution of responses, actual data collected from you. 23%, 18% of you said 23%. 46% of you said 33%. 29% of you said 43%, and 7% of you said 53%. Now, this is a question to which there is actually a real answer in 2021, okay, given by the Bank of Israel. The answer is 42.5%. So those of you who said 43% are the closest. Now, the think tank Kohelet, which many of you might have heard of, argues that this number is understated, that the true number should actually be more like 45%, because in international comparisons, there are some differences in the way that Israel treats various types of spending versus the way other countries treat various types of spending. In particular, a lot of the pension system in Israel is not run through the government, but run through the private economy. And also, in Israel, welfare benefits are not taxed, whereas in other countries they are taxed. So for international comparability, usually we would want to add about 2.5 percentage points to that number, according to Kohelet. So 43% is really just about right. So congrats to those of you who got it right, but those of you who didn't, don't worry. I mean, this is not a test. I'm just trying to see where your perceptions are relative to reality, and maybe we can move those perceptions a little bit closer to reality. Okay, great. So next poll question coming up is a very similar question, but it is about U.S. government spending. U.S. government spending. Approximately what percent of the U.S. economy, in terms of GDP, was government spending in 2021? The land of the free and the home of the brave. Free market capitalism, unbridled. What percent of the U.S. economy, GDP, was government spending? What percent of every dollar in the U.S. economy was spent by the federal, state, or local governments in the United States of America? 11%, 22%, 33%, 44%, or 55%. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that if this guy doesn't work out as a professor, he can be a game show host. Okay. So what do we think here? Okay, we got 27 responses. Yeah, don't think too much. And again, I don't want to give you too much time because I know you could do some Googling and things like that. So I'm going to lock the responses right now, and I'm going to show you your responses. Okay. So here we have it. 11%. So 3% of you said 11%. 28% of you said 22%. The mode. 38% of you said 33%. Okay, 14% of you said 44%, and 17% of you said 55%. Well, the answer is 44%. Federal, state, and local governments in the United States of America. So really not much different than Israel. Okay, about the same, 44%. How does that, I mean, apparently that's surprising to many of you because the U.S. has a reputation as being a relatively free marketplace. Yet, 44% of the economy is government spending. And furthermore, of the rest of the economy, okay, it's not as though the government doesn't intervene at all in the rest of the economy. They're often regulating various sectors. There's obviously a lot of regulation that goes on. So makes you really think about what exactly is a free market economy. Okay, I'm not really sure that we can call the U.S. one anymore at this point. You know, the United States didn't have an income tax until 1913. The United States did not have a federal income tax until 1913. So compared to 100 years ago, government is much, much bigger. And I guess I say this in part as sort of a tale of what happens when countries begin to go down the path of taxing and having bigger government. Often good intentions of the government programs tend to spill over into bigger and bigger activities. So So those are sort of some of the introductory questions. So what I want to do is let's look at how this compares across some of the other countries that we have here. So if you look at this, these are the countries represented by our program here. So you can see that this only goes through 2020 because we're looking for international comparability across all countries. So there are only a few organizations that really track that, the IMF, the OECD, and so on. So what you can see is that the United States is the sort of mustard-colored line there. That's that number that's up to the mid to upper 40s. And you can see that actually compared to other countries, the United States is relatively high compared to some of the other countries represented in this program. I think we've been talking about that the past couple of days. Israel and the United States are really right next to each other. And if you look at the G7, those are other large Western countries in addition to the United States. They average even a little bit higher than the United States. And if we look at a trend, at general trends here in the G7 countries and in the West, what we saw was a big increase around the middle part of the first decade of the 2000s, and then a big spike up in 2020. Okay, so I think it's obvious what happened in the big spike up in 2020. What happened? What was going on there? COVID, right? And the governments did a ton of spending, a lot of additional spending, particularly in the form of unemployment benefits, interventions in the job market, in some cases direct checks to citizens, and so on. So that was a big increase in government spending. And also, it's a percent of GDP, so the denominator went down a little bit as well. But again, the numbers that we looked at just now in the poll, those were 2021. So it came down a little bit. This pattern of spending going up during emergencies and then coming down a little bit afterwards was also seen in the first decade of the 2000s. What happened there around 2008, 2009? Anybody study this or remember? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. What was that? Yes, exactly. Subprime crisis, okay, which became a global financial crisis. And during that time, we see a similar pattern in that spending went up, didn't spike up quite as quickly as it did during COVID, but it went up, and then it began to subside gradually, but not that quickly. Okay, so that's a bit of a historical comparison there. All right, so next question I want to ask is, how does the government actually raise money? How does it go about raising money? What are the ways governments can raise money? We know some obvious ones off the top of our head, right? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Taxes. Okay, taxes number one. What else can the government do to raise money?
Bonds.
Okay, they can sell bonds, which is otherwise known as borrowing money, right? So because the people who buy the bonds are lending money to the government. If you invest in government bonds, you are lending money to the government. Okay, so they can tax, they can borrow. What else can they do? They can print money, okay? They can print money, so that's otherwise known as seigniorage. So if I'm running a government and I'm able to, produce a piece of paper, and it costs me 2 cents to produce this little piece of paper, and I can write $1 on there, then bingo, I've just created 98 cents of money just out of thin air. That was the old-fashioned way of printing money. The newer way of printing money has to do, things are done more electronically, and they're done with transfers between the central bank and the treasury of a country. So if the central bank essentially credits the treasury's account and allows the treasury to sell securities into markets, or as happens in the United States, they claim, we don't do direct money printing. The Federal Reserve doesn't directly buy bonds from the treasury. Instead, the treasury sells the bonds to a group of about a dozen or two market participants, and then the Federal Reserve directly buys those bonds. So it's a bit indirect, but it's seigniorage. It's money that's being created in order to for the Treasury to be able to spend money. So those are three ways. Is there one more way we can think of, the way the governments might raise money? Yeah, go ahead.
Public aid.
Okay, well, public aid sounds like a way they might spend money. How would they raise money through? Explain.
Public development aid, like in developing countries.
Receiving public development aid. Yes, okay, so they can receive development aid from international organizations. Okay, that's good. Yes, what else? Okay, state investments, so returns on state investments. So many countries that have sovereign wealth funds or countries that run pension systems for their employees or for their citizens, they're earning money on those things. Okay, very good. Anything else? Yeah.
Natural resources.
Okay, they can be endowed with natural resources, and then they can sell those natural resources into the market. So that's another good one. Yes?
Allowing the banks to lower the reserve ratio.
Okay, that sounds like creating money. That's sort of another modern-day version of seigniorage. I mean, they're allowing the banks to lower the reserve ratio, and then the banks are creating money because they're levered up. Good. So we got it's everything. Yeah. Okay.
against some companies that it owns and create revenue.
Yes, okay, so and this is related to the point that you made, which is that if they sell or privatize assets that they have, then they can create revenue that way. Good, okay, anything else? Yeah.
There's the inflation tax.
Yes. That's what we think of as seigniorage or money creation. Inflation, if we let inflation happen, then we're creating money. Those two things are...
You raise all your debts when inflation goes up.
Yes, so that's printing money to create inflation. It makes the value of your debts go way down. There's one other one that I think we haven't quite gotten yet. Yeah.
Carbon credit.
Okay, well that's, how do you create revenue out of carbon credit? You mean carbon tax or selling rights to pollute or...
First, you invest in green technology, and
Yes.
The less you produce in terms of greenhouse gases, the less the more you have in terms of percentage of the percentage allowed in every country to pollute. So the less you pollute, the more you have a percentage to sell to other countries that can use it as to other countries that can afford to have green solutions. So they buy these percentage of credit carbons, so they can pollute more without.
This is very good. So if you've entered into international agreements with other countries regarding the allowance of releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you could benefit from that if you're able to reduce emissions more than they are, right? So just one other thing I just want to mention. I only put 4 up on my slide. You're actually very, very good at coming up with ways that the government can raise money. Perhaps you have a future in public service. Actually, I hope not. I hope so. But one other thing, which is fees for the use of public services. Okay, so that's another thing, is that if you run a national railway or you run a national airline or something like that, you're charging fees for the usage of those things. That's another way. But all the ways that you brought up are very good as well. So I think we have a pretty good sense here. You guys are very good. You have a very good sense of how the governments finance their activities. So next question is, how do you think we're doing around the world in terms of running balanced budgets? Are we doing a lot of borrowing, or are we mostly financing expenditures through the first 3 items and some of the other items you mentioned? Yeah.
I think in most cases the budgets are in deficit.
In most cases, the budgets are in deficit. Okay. So yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe it depends on the country, but like most get their money from taxes, but a lot also borrow from another country.
Yes.
Most of their
Yes.
Sure.
Okay, I'll repeat what he says. Okay, so he said that there are a lot of countries that are actually borrowing by selling bonds to other investors who are in other countries. All right, so let's look at the data. So here are 3 countries, and the other 2 are on the next slide. Okay, Bahrain, Israel, and Morocco. So these are the solid lines are expenditures. The dashed lines are revenues. This only goes through 2020. So if I start out with Bahrain, I hope that you folks from Bahrain will point out to me that by 2022, actually, this has now been corrected. So in 2022, actually, Bahrain is running a small budget surplus, even though in 2020 it was running a large deficit. What happened, actually? Why was it that during the second decade of the 2000s there was such a large budget deficit occurring in Bahrain? Why is that? Okay, so one thing is that the oil price was quite low during that time, and the Bahrain government derives a lot of revenues from having a high oil price given their endowments of oil resources, right? So that's one thing. Other things happening?
Starting from which year you said?
Well, if we look at the graph around 2010, 11, 12, those lines start to diverge. That's what I've heard as well, political issues. That's a very euphemistic way of saying there were things happening, and yes, they were expensive, and basically the government was running a big deficit to address a number of those issues, right? So those have sort of corrected themselves, and now with the oil price in 2020, anybody remember what happened to the oil price in 2020? It went negative, which means that you had a market where you had so much oil floating around that you had to, if you had oil, you had to pay someone to take it off your hands. Okay, so oil became, for a short period of time, an economic bad as opposed to economic good.
Ukraine has also found a new reserve, a really big reserve of oil as well. So, but it's going to take at least 5 years to show because of. It's going to take time to produce it.
Okay. Okay. So new reserves found, so that the future is looking much brighter than this 2020 line. Even the present is looking much brighter than where things look in 2020 in terms of deficits. Okay, how about Israel? Deficit, right? Pretty big deficit. So basically, over this time period, there were moderate deficits. Actually, the budget was roughly balanced in the right before the financial crisis. Then revenues kind of went down, but expenditures have been relatively stable. Of course, in COVID, and we saw this yesterday when we were looking at these Fraser reports here, there was a big increase in the deficit due to a big increase in spending, which I'll talk about in a minute where that came from. Morocco, to some extent, as well, sort of similar pattern actually to Israel, with small to moderate deficits being run in the second decade of the 2000s, and then the deficit increasing in 2020. Okay, how about two more countries, United Arab Emirates and then United States, which I put up here just for comparison. So UAE has had run a pretty big surplus. Actually, that's what the dashed lines are revenues, solid lines are expenditures. Expenditures now come up a bit, but in general, overall, you would have to say that things are fiscally in pretty good shape for the United Arab Emirates, and then United States. Huge increase in the deficit in 2020, right? So this is the mid-40s% of spending that we were looking at before. Here are revenues which have been relatively flat. So the United States, was running, according to the IMF numbers, about a 15% budget deficit in 2020, which is, these are big numbers when we're talking about many trillions of dollars of budget. Okay, so governments generally, with some exceptions, are doing a lot of borrowing, a lot of selling of bonds. All right, so what do the governments do? I think it's worth looking at what the governments do. Just some data on that. Here is Israel. Okay, first of all, how they raise money is on the left. That's the total revenues, and then the total expenditures on the right. Those are percentage numbers. So if we look at total revenue, how is money typically raised in Israel largely? So what's the biggest slice of the pie here is this goods and services part, 32%. Where does that fit into our scheme of how governments raise money? What is that?
Taxes.
Taxes. What type of taxes? Goods and services?
Income.
Yeah.
Corporate taxes.
Well, individual income taxes here, that's 19%. Corporate income is here, that's 8%. What are goods and services? VAT, right? So these are consumption taxes. So remember, taxation is not only on income. First, you earn the income and you pay taxes when you earn it. And then you spend the money and you pay taxes, consumption taxes, when you consume. So there are multiple layers going on there, right? We also have property taxes. So should you buy some property, you're going to be paying some property taxes. Then, there are many other ways that the government raises revenue that's in the 19%. One of the ones we were talking about before was land leases or sales of land, things like that. Okay, so there are many other ways that the governments raise money. On the right, we have the expenditures. So what is the biggest expenditure category is social protection. What is social protection? What is sort of generally meant under that?
Security,
Welfare.
Welfare. Social protection is welfare. Okay, it's largely not security or safety. So safety is represented by defense and safety. Those are the two main categories there. So social protection is unemployment insurance, housing benefits, including rental assistance for new immigrants or for the poor or disabled, benefits for families and children. Those all fall in the social protection category. So 29% of spending is social protection. Defense and safety adds up to only 16%. This 12 and 4. We've got education, 16%, health, 14%. Lots of things that the government is doing. Let's compare this to a couple of the other countries on our list here. Here's UAE. Okay, so total revenue here. All right, so obviously we have, as we've learned, we have no individual income tax in UAE. There is a corporate income tax that is levied on what? How does this work, UAE folks? Well, only one, I guess. How does this work? Oh, sorry, over here. Sorry, over here. Where is he? Over there, yes. Yes. Do you want to tell us? I thought there was no taxes. It was proclaimed that there were no taxes in UAE, but
there were no taxes in UAE.
Okay.
But, before a couple of years ago, they stopped to let us pay taxes, but it's very low, so it's only 5%. But it's not into the income. It's like when you are trying to buy anything from the shop.
Okay, so they have put in a corporate income tax of 9% because actually countries have agreed around the world to a 15% minimum corporate tax, and UAE said, well, let's start with 9% because there was some of the other countries were upset that there were a lot of zero corporate tax countries out there. So they, through the OECD, there has been this 15% minimum corporate tax has been put in. Also, there are some types of businesses I understand do pay some corporate taxes, have historically paid some corporate taxes in the United Arab Emirates. But notably relative to Israel, there is no individual income tax. Okay, so what's all of the other? How does the government of the UAE finance itself? Oil. Okay, well, what do they do? Okay, so they can sell oil, right? Or often they're selling leases or license fees to businesses of a variety of kinds. That's one key thing that they're doing. So, okay, very different revenue raising structure. Am I too loud, too soft? Do I need to?
No, not good.
No, okay, it's too soft. People don't usually tell me that I'm not talking loud enough, but I can be louder. What are they spending it on? Social protection was what Israel was spending it on. Not much in the way of social protection here, but a big part is public services. Why do you think that's happening here in this data?
Infrastructure.
Okay, infrastructure in part. How about the employment of people in UAE? Who is the biggest employer for most people in UAE? Yeah.
I think governmental workers.
Yes.
For the government, and then they get like
Governmental workers. Okay, so 78%, I believe, of the workforce in UAE works for the government. Is a government employee.
Locals, yeah.
Locals.
Like we are minority in our country, so.
Okay, so 78% of locals work for the government. So that's what this is here. Okay, that's what this is. Okay, so, and other categories are kind of spread around. All right, how does this look compared to the United States of America? Let's compare it to the United States of America, okay? The United States of America raised $6.4 trillion in 2020, and they spent $9.98 trillion in 2020. What did they raise the money on from? Okay, individual income tax is 34%. The corporate income tax, despite all the discussion about it, is only 4% of total revenue raised. Companies are pretty good at structuring their activities in the United States to avoid the corporate income tax, which is one reason actually that a lot of people have suggested on both the left and the right that the United States, a while ago, they were suggesting the United States should abolish the corporate income tax because it's just very inefficient. There's this incredibly complex corporate tax code, and most companies are pretty much able to hire lots of lawyers and lobbyists and figure out ways of not paying that much in the way of corporate income tax. Instead, what's actually happened is things have gone another direction. The United States got really involved in this initiative to get all countries to agree to a 15% minimum corporate income tax because the U.S. was concerned that their companies were taking advantage too much of moving their operations to other parts of the world where tax was lower, tax rates were lower. So instead of working with that, they've now gone and tried to exert moral pressure on other countries of the world to raise their corporate income taxes. Okay, so saying, well, we're going to go around the world and say, countries like, Switzerland or Luxembourg or the Netherlands or the Cayman Islands, places that have got really low corporate income taxes, we're going to tell you all, we need to get together and agree that we're going to have we're going to put a floor on the corporate income tax, and that floor is going to be 15%. When you put a floor, when you get together with a bunch of other people and you put a floor on the price of something, we have a name for that in economics, actually. It's called a cartel. Sounds actually kind of like a cartel, with countries getting together and saying, we're going to agree we're not going to tax our companies, or we're going to tax our companies a minimum of 15% on their corporate income. Okay, anyway, so corporate income tax, pretty small part of the U.S. total revenue base, but a lot of the political direction right now wants to try to make that much bigger. Okay, so U.S. also gets a lot of money from what are called social contributions, so our pension system, Social Security, our medical system for retirees is funded by payroll taxes, so those are social contributions. At the state and local government level, we also collect property taxes, so we do it all. We've also got sales taxes on goods and services, so all kinds of taxes in the United States of America. What do we spend it on? Well, okay, relative to sort of the other countries here, social protection, we saw that was big in Israel. What's another category here that's suddenly quite big at the public level in the U.S.? Health. is really big. So we have two really, really big public medical programs in the United States. One is called Medicare, that is for the elderly, and one is called Medicaid, that is for the poor. And these are very, very expensive programs that are provided through the government. All right. So and I would say that in terms of coverage of government programs, the United States is not that different in terms of coverage from many other countries, although we do have a large segment of the population that is covered only by private insurance. What is sort of different is that our health care tends to be very expensive in the United States. Okay, we've also got education, defense, and safety. I think one of the other takeaways of this is in all these countries, defense and public safety are a pretty low % of the budget when you think about it. Most of the expenditures in the U.S., and this is, again, integrated state, local, and federal levels, most of the expenditures are on health and social protection. So it's really kind of a welfare state, actually. Okay, so I think the big question is how big should government be? So we could start out thinking about two extremes, right? No government, no taxes, no spending. And the government has 100% share in the economy. Clearly, we don't want to be at either of those exact corner points. Some people argue, the anarchists say we should have no government, no taxes, no spending. Everything could just be done privately. There's one thing about that I think, what's the first argument that you would make against that if you were debating an anarchist or sort of a anarcho-capitalist who said that everything should just be done privately? What's the one thing you really need the government to do for things to function?
Enforce contracts.
Enforce contracts. If the government's not enforcing contracts,
Regulation.
well, regulating what?
The process of the private companies how to do things.
Okay, well, what do they want to stop the companies from doing? So this is where the anarchists would say, why do you need to stop the company?
Take advantage of their role, maybe.
Okay, taking advantage. Okay, is defined by whom? It's tricky, right? Taking advantage, so this is where, anti-regulation people would say we don't need to regulate companies because things can be regulated through private contracts. But those who are pro-regulation would say we do because they might take advantage of some portion of the population. Mentoring the companies. Okay. Well, I don't know. Maybe I don't know which direction the mentoring should go. Should the government mentor the companies or should the companies mentor the government? I'm not sure. Yes?
Maybe I would say I'll respond saying you take a look at its economic history and what happened in 1929 with the Great Depression. I mean, back at that time when financial system found a loophole, like a gray zone, it was used and abused until it led to an economic collapse. So maybe the regulation is needed in order to prevent us from what could happen in the absence of that.
Okay, right. So companies could do things that would be too destabilizing for the economy. That's a pro-regulation view, right? Okay, so why don't we go all the way to the other end? What would happen if the government had 100% share in the economy, 100% income tax rate? What would happen then? Yeah. You would have gulags. Okay. Well, what if it were a benevolent government? Benevolent government that didn't want to put people in a gulag. Still. Inefficiency. Okay, government's generally not as efficient as the private sector at running things. Okay, what is my incentive to work if the government's going to take 100% of my pay? I have no incentive to work. Okay, so if the government's going to take 100% of my pay, I don't really have an incentive to actually go work, nor do I have an incentive to create a business, to invest. I mean, what's the point, right? What are they going to? So maybe you're right. Maybe we would have a gulag because the only way they could get me to work would be to actually force me to work. So maybe we would go in that direction. Let's outline and critically assess some purported motivations for government spending. Okay, I'm going to stay away a little bit from regulation because Michal talked a lot with you about regulation. Regulation is a big topic. I want to talk about that 44% of the economy that is government spending and what the justifications are for that. Okay, so one thing is, we talked about this, came up right away, rule of law, right? The protection of private property and the enforcement of private contracts. So I think even most fairly hardline libertarian types are going to tell you that you need some rule of law in order for a society to properly function. There's a kind of intellectual history of this. In America, we sort of learn a lot about the following kind of path of philosophical history, right? We have Thomas Hobbes in 1651 who conceived of the idea that if there were no strong government, that you would have total chaos, essentially. Everybody would just be spending all of their time fighting against other people in what's called the Hobbesian state of nature. And the Hobbesian state of nature, you also have no right or ability to, it's very hard to defend your own property. And so he said in that situation, unless you have a strong government, there is no place for industry, meaning there's no incentive for anyone to start a company because the fruit thereof is uncertain. So why would you start a company if you knew you weren't going to be able to, even just defend the assets that you built there? There was this kind of artwork that often accompanies his ideas. He said we need this monster of a leviathan, a huge, powerful-handed government to get all this stuff under control. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have an ordered society. Okay. So then what happened later was this philosopher came along who's been very influential in the United States, in the formation of the United States, John Locke. And John Locke said that government, you didn't have to have a super heavy-handed giant government. You just had to basically guarantee three things. The government had to guarantee the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Those were the three kind of key roles of the government. John Locke said you can limit the government to protecting those natural rights, and then things will follow. Okay, so I'm an economist, not a philosopher, and I trace the sort of evolution of a certain branch of economics actually to the philosophical path that these people built. A lot happened in between, but how much protection do we need? And some economists, I think, answered gave a pretty good answer to that question, particularly this gentleman, Rauh in 1960, The Problem of Social Cost. If he were still alive, I don't know how he'd feel about my putting him up next to Hobbes' Leviathan and John Locke, but probably pretty good because it's actually a compliment. So I think that Coase's ideas, he was a University of Chicago economist who died some years ago, were some of the most powerful ideas about what you actually need the government to be doing in order to protect life, liberty, and property. And he wrote a great example that I'm going to give you. This is also involves a baker, just like Russ Roberts talked about baking bread. And it also involves the problem of externalities, which I thought Russ Roberts was going to go into when he asked you what would you do if you had a roommate who didn't want to wash the dishes. But here's the problem of social cost. Okay, a doctor and a baker share an office building. The baker's loud machinery disrupts the doctor, so the doctor cannot treat patients while the machine is running. Okay, so we have a problem. This is like your roommate who won't do the dishes. Okay, suppose you are the doctor and the baker has this loud machinery next door, very upsetting to you. If you're the baker, well, you have to run this machinery, so you may feel bad for the doctor, but you need to bake your bread. Okay, so the old solution before Coase was the baker is doing something bad. The baker needs to compensate the doctor, or perhaps the doctor would go to the government and say, you need to pass a noise ordinance here in this building so that I can do my work. All right, that would be the old solution, that there would be some regulation that would come in place to try to address this. But what Coase saw was the power of what markets can do in order to ensure protection of private property, the enforcement of private contracts, and the rule of law. So Coase pointed out that as long as it's legally clear who owns the rights to control the noise level in the building, private parties will bargain to a solution, and it will be an efficient solution. The only thing you really need to have happen is the government needs to make it clear who owns the right to control noise in the building, or preferably, even better, before the doctor and the baker sign a lease in the building, it's clear that the owner of the building who's doing this leasing out of the space that the doctor has and the space that the baker has is making it clear who owns the right to determine the noise level in the building. Okay? So if the baker owns the right to determine the noise level in the building and the doctor signed a contract, well, then the baker can continue if he wants to keep running the machinery. If the doctor owns the right to the noise level in the building, the doctor could ask the baker to do something. Here's an example. Okay, suppose that quiet baking machinery costs $4,000 and soundproofing the doctor's office costs $6,000. Let's think through what's going to happen in this world of private contracting. Okay, so suppose that the doctor has the right to control the noise level in the building. What is going to happen then if the doctor says, hey, it's my right to control the noise level in the building. What does the baker have to do? They have to pay the $4,000 and buy the quieter machinery or move out, right? Then it's very clear. Okay, what if the baker owns the right to determine the noise level? The doctor, exactly. You both said it. So some people immediately say, oh well, the doctor will soundproof the office for $6,000. Actually, that's not what would happen. What would happen is what the two of you said, which is that the doctor will pay the baker for the quieter machine. Okay.
How many bakers there are in the building?
Yes, it depends how many bakers are in the building. Things could get a little rough. But yes, if there are contracts in place, and there have to be some other conditions, right, like negligible transaction costs, no overall wealth effects, some other things. But this shows you the power actually of private contracts in ensuring that there is protection of private property. Okay, so rule of law, I think even very serious, hardcore libertarian people will say that protection of private property, enforcement of private contracts is important for government to have that, but most of it is about enforcing contracts, because as long as the private sector can write these contracts, you can get to efficient solutions. So that was the Ronald Coase theorem, problem of social cost solution. Okay, just a little survey here, another survey to keep us engaged. So we talked yesterday a little bit about comparing countries across different measures. So what is the country that is viewed as having the greatest judicial effectiveness score? I used the Heritage Foundation's indices for this, as opposed to the Fraser Institute, but they tend to line up pretty well. These are countries, not countries that are in this program, but rather Singapore, Switzerland, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and the United States. Okay, just guess if you don't know. Just curious what your impression is about the country with the greatest judicial effectiveness score. This is really about enforcement of contracts, lack of corruption, objectivity, political objectivity of the courts as well. So, oh, it's not, well, is it not showing on people's devices? Oh, well, you need to refresh. 14 people have responded, so, yeah. Okay. 17 people have responded. Just guess if you don't know. Just guess to tell me you're still with us. Okay, great. 22, 23, 25. Okay, we're doing well. Okay, great. All right, terrific. Well, I'm gonna lock it now. 26. Great. Okay, 27. Excellent. Okay. So responses here. Okay. So Singapore, right? So Singapore is regularly rated the most free country in the world on both Fraser and the Heritage Institute Index. So good reason to think that Singapore would be the winner. Okay, 18% you said Switzerland, 7% United Kingdom, 21% New Zealand, 4% USA. Okay, so here are the results, and it turns out Switzerland is number one. Okay, and Singapore doesn't actually do that well on this measure. Why not? Well, they have a reliable judicial process, but if you try to sue the government in Singapore, you're not going to win. Yes. Yes. So the index is about whether it's the judicial effectiveness. How effective are the courts? How effective is the judiciary, particularly in protecting contractual rights? Is there due process in civil and criminal matters? What's the perceived quality of contract enforcement? That's the measure. Okay, so Singapore, it's very efficient. The problem is that if you and the government are in a dispute, you're going to lose. In the United States, there are many situations where people sue the government and win. They sue the government for violations of employment law. A bunch of state governments sued the federal government over the vaccine mandate in 2021. So governments can sue each other in the United States. So that's something the United States has going for it. Heritage dings the United States a little bit on the growing strength of an unaccountable administrative state and importance of presidential decree. So even though Heritage is a very pro-U.S. institute, they've downgraded the U.S. on those grounds. Switzerland actually wins for having an independent judicial system that's effective throughout the economy. So something to keep in mind. Some of these, if you're thinking about emulating the court systems of countries, you want to think about which ones you actually really want to emulate. Okay, so let's talk about. I'm going to skip ahead to talk about the social safety net. So this is the next thing. Okay, so now that we've gotten through contract enforcement, let's think about the social safety net. So I want to talk a little bit about the social safety net in the United States, because compared to about 100 years ago, things are completely different today. So about 100 years ago, we really didn't have a social safety net in the United States of any really meaningful size. Now we have a very, very large one, which, as you saw, represents a very significant proportion of U.S. government spending. So there was all this legislation that happened, in the 1930s after the Great Depression. We had something called the New Deal in the United States, which really was the first very major intervention of the federal government into the economy in a variety of ways. 1935 created Social Security, which is our old age pension program. It created unemployment insurance, which is our program for paying people unemployment benefits when they lose their jobs. In the 1960s, this went into a whole additional phase with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, otherwise known as the Great Society. Then the Social Security Act of 1965 created the public medical programs, Medicare and Medicaid. And then in the late 90s, we also had some additional expansions, including a child tax credit. So some people view this as a glorious victory of progressiveness and, the fact that we've, addressed poverty through these programs. So this is the justification for this anti-poverty spending. But there are really big issues with this that have to be taken into account. Costs of this, one of the major ones are incentives. So one of the things we know from economics is that people consider their marginal tax rate in deciding whether to work or whether to work more. In a system where you have progressive income taxes, you typically think of the people at the top as paying the highest tax rates. But that's not actually necessarily true when you think about the marginal tax rate. And there's a great study by Casey Mulligan, who's a University of Chicago economist, who made the following graph. What this shows, these are people at different levels of earnings. So these are, down here, these are actually people who are above median levels of earnings. And these are people who are below median levels of earnings. And he's actually graphing statutory marginal tax rates here for these different groups of people. And what he's finding is that for people who, even people who have got relatively low levels of earnings, marginal tax rates are really high, actually. Marginal tax rates rose to as high as 60% for low-income workers in 2009. How is this possible? I thought that taxes were only actually levied on really high-income people. I thought you didn't have to pay big taxes if you were really poor. What's he talking about? How can there be high marginal tax rates on poorer people? Any ideas? Yes? Okay, VATs could be one. He's only looking at income taxes, though. So VATs could be one, and indeed, a VAT or a consumption tax has a, hits poor people big, in a larger way because they're spending more of their money on consumption, right? Okay, what else could be going on? How could the poor have yeah?
They don't have an accountant like the rich men.
They don't have an accountant, okay, right? That could be it, right? Suppose that there were a flat tax of 50%, but rich people were able to hire an accountant to make that go down to 20%, but poor people couldn't. That would be it, except that's actually not the case. We have a very progressive tax system in the United States, and if you look at the federal income tax tables and the state income tax tables, people who earn below median earnings don't actually pay very much in the way of taxes. Actually, a presidential candidate from around 10 years ago pointed that out and got roundly chastised for sort of implying that half of the United States were sort of moochers or living off the rich. But that's not what's going on either. How could this be? How can marginal tax rates be so high? Yes?
Maybe share of spending and share of saving.
Okay, share of spending and saving. All right. So it could have something to do with that. Yeah?
Directed tax, so tax on gas, tax on other things.
Okay, except this is only the income tax. So I want you to do the following thought experiment for me. You're going to figure it out. Okay, so suppose you are not working, and you're going to decide whether or not you're going to work. You're going to get a job, okay? And you look for a job, and you actually find a job, and the job is offered to you. How could it be that there could be a 50% implicit tax on your taking this job? What could you lose? Yes. What could you lose? Go ahead.
Maybe you compare it to the situation which you're not working in.
Yes.
And then you get a lot of money in the unemployment
Yes.
from the government, and then you say, okay, if I will work, it will be like 60% compared to the situation which I'm not working.
Exactly. Exactly. So that is what Casey Mulligan recognized when he did this. And how could it be as high as 60%? It's quite simple, right? So here's an example where your marginal tax rate would be 50%. You get offered a job. The job pays $400 a week. But if you're not working, you're getting $200 a week worth of unemployment and other benefits. So therefore, if you start working, there's a 50% implicit tax on your work. So, and these taxes, these implicit taxes, went way up after the financial crisis when the federal government of the United States dramatically expanded unemployment insurance. So they expanded unemployment insurance to 96 weeks. 96 weeks. Let me do my math, okay? That's like almost 2 years of unemployment insurance. So, and they also changed the eligibility requirements for unemployment insurance. This was around the time of 2009, 10, 11, right after that big financial crisis, subprime crisis. But it happened again, actually, during COVID when, believe it or not, the marginal tax rate rose to 145% during COVID. How could that be? Well, in the United States, the federal government passed something that said, if you're unemployed, we're going to give you an additional $600 a week, unconditional on anything at all. So how's that job looking now, that $400 a week job? Not that good, because if you're not working, you can collect $600 a week. And if you are working, you get $400 a week, $600 a month. So adjust my numbers into monthly figures and you see what I mean. They calculated that you get 145% marginal tax rate. By the way, Casey Mulligan is a great, very interesting author. You should read this book if you're interested in going to economics graduate school. You should pick up this book, Chicago Price Theory. And if you pick up this book or you look at it and you think to yourself, wow, this is really horrible, then congratulations, you're one of the billions of normal people in the world. If you pick up this book and you think, wow, this is really cool, then I think there's a future for you getting a PhD in economics. Okay? It's one of my favorite books. I carry it around to cafes. I like to be seen around reading it. It's kind of like a find Josh reading Chicago Price Theory in a public space sort of thing. So, okay. How about Israel, right? So briefly, Israel pre-2020 had fairly stable expenditures on welfare programs and also introduced an emphasis on social investment to improve human capital. So one example in Israel is something called the Saving for Every Child program, which I was interested to discover, where the government, for people who are receiving, the government puts 50 shekels a week into a saving program for every child, and people who are receiving government benefits can also contribute more on their own to these accounts. So that's an example of like a kind of social investment approach. But largely over the sort of first decade of the of the 2000s, expenditure in Social Security and services were largely stable, or if anything, even declining slightly. What happened during COVID? Okay, all went out the window. I don't know how well you can see these graphs, but this graph, you can see that something is spiking up here dramatically. These are the recipients of unemployment insurance benefits or income support, right? It went up from something like around 100,000 to 900,000 during COVID. So we just said, no, unemployment. You can qualify for unemployment insurance. This here is an interesting graph. It shows the total expenditure on unemployment insurance in Israel. It's going year by year, and then the graph switches to showing month by month. And the point is that once COVID began, 1 month's worth of expenditure became basically the equivalent of, in the past, 1 year's worth of expenditure. And they also relaxed the rules to allow increased duration of unemployment insurance, shortening the length of time to qualify from 12 to 6 months of work, and so on. Now, this isn't to say that there was necessarily no need for government intervention during COVID. There was a lot of panicking going on, and that was leading to a lot of disruptions of economic activity. So maybe there was some reason to address that. Kind of ironically, often what was going on, if you observe what governments were doing, is they were shutting down the economy with one hand, and then paying people unemployment benefits and welfare benefits with the other hand, which ineffectively, maybe with the justification, we have a pandemic going on here, we have to do this. That's what they were saying, but effectively they were creating, basically a sort of, socialist economy with the ability to receive money from the government without having to do any work. So some would say there was a reason for that, but on the other hand, these emergency spending programs have actually really led to a very, very big increase in the government activity in the economy, in some questionable ways, I'd say. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I have a lot of stuff that I want to cover. I want to do another poll with you too before we get to the point of doing some Q&A. So redistribution to address inequality. Here's my third reason proposed reason for government intervention. Maybe the government needs to intervene to redistribute money in order to address inequality, and there are a number of different ways that can be done: through direct anti-poverty programs, for example, through regulatory policies that limit the extent of inequality, through progressive income taxation, right? Progressive income taxation means you charge a higher income tax rate to higher income people than lower income people. But let's start with some facts. Okay, another poll for you. All right, so we're going to talk about the top 1% of income earners. Approximately what percent of income does the top 1% of Israeli taxpayers earn? Because you hear a lot about this. Oh, the rich, the top 1%. Okay, so here's some choices. So the first choice is 1%. What would that mean? That would mean actually no income inequality. If the top 1% of earners earn 1% of the income, that would mean there would be no income inequality at all. The next choice is 7%. Okay, that would say that the top 1% earns 7% of the income in the economy. That would be some inequality there. Then going up to 17%, 27%, or 37%. So approximately what percent of income does the top 1% earn? This is for you to tell me what you think. Okay, 15 of you have answered. Don't Google it. Don't take too long. Just pick something. Just answer something. You know, we're going to find out. Just play along with the game, okay? You know, 21, 23. Okay, most of you are playing along. I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, 25, we're doing pretty well. 26, I'm going to lock it now. And anybody else want to answer? Okay, I'm locking it, and we're going to show the results now. Okay, so the results are pretty evenly distributed. Okay, looks like could be mostly random guessing, although nobody said 1% no income inequality. Okay, that's correct. There is some income inequality. And the answer in Israel to the percent of income that the top 1% earns is around 17%. Okay, 16.5%. So that's what the answer is. Top 1% earns 17%. So that's those are the official numbers. Now, let's do this same exercise now for the United States of America. Actually, that poll's not showing up. I'll just show you what it is for the United States of America. The United States turns out that it's 20.1% for the United States. Israel, 16.5%. The United States, 20.1%. Slightly different sources. One is from the World Inequality Report. The other is from the U.S. Tax Foundation. But basically, it's not that different. A little bit more in the U.S., 20% of the income as opposed to 16%. Okay, I want to ask you another question now. This one is not one that has a correct answer. All right, this is a question about should. So this is one where I want to ask you, in a society where, whoops, it's locked. I need to unlock it for you here. In a society where the top 1% earns 20% of the income, what percent of the total taxes should the top 1% of taxpayers pay? This is a should question, right? So think about a society like Israel, or more accurately like the United States, where the top 1% earn 20% of the income. There's a lot of income inequality there. Okay, before tax, they earn 20% of the income. Now you're the government, you're the benevolent government, and you want to do some redistribution. Okay, how much of your the total taxes that you collect should be paid by that top 1%? Okay, so some choices here include 1% of the taxes. Okay, well, I mean, that would be, they earn 20% of the income, so they paid only 1% of the taxes, then you're really favoring them quite a bit. That's, you know, maybe that's your preference, but it's generally not thought of as being common social preference. Okay, same thing. 10% would be less than their share of the market income. 20% would be, you know, if they earn 20% of the income, they pay 20% of the taxes. 30%, 40%, or 50% or more. Those are the ideas. So 20 of you have answered. Don't, you know, just tell me what. Don't introspect too much. You know, this is not binding on your society or country. I say if you were in charge, you know, what would you do? Just a hypothetical. Okay. 26 of you have answered. Okay. I mean, you can't Google this one. So okay. So let's see what we got here. Okay. So it looks like 15% of you said that there should be a 10% tax on them. I mean, after all, they do only represent 1% of the people, so maybe they should pay 10% of the taxes. Okay, or even 1% of the taxes. Okay, 37% of you said they earn 20% of the income, they should pay 37% of the taxes. Then 22% of you said some progressivity, they should pay 30% of the taxes. Okay, 40% of you, 11% said 40% of the taxes, and 15%, 15 or more. So basically, you know, around a quarter of you are on the very heavy sort of progressive taxation side of things. And I would say that, you know, around, if you were in this 20% category, you're sort of a flat tax person. And if you're in this category here, 10%, you're pretty much saying that, you know, I don't really care that they earn more. Everybody should just basically pay the same amount. So, okay, so one more poll question then is, in the United States, what percent of federal taxes does the top 1% pay? Does the top 1% pay? So now that you've said what you think it should be, if you were in charge, what percent does the top 1% pay? Okay, now this is a factual question. So 12% of you have answered. Okay, what percent of federal taxes does the top 1% pay? Well, 19 of you have answered. Okay, let's just guess if you don't know. Okay, great. Okay, so most of you have answered. Thank you very much. So let's look at what the results are here. So looks pretty spread out, all right? So the true answer is 39%. Top 1% pay 39% of the taxes. So they earn 20% of the income. They pay 39% of the taxes. For about a quarter of you, that seemed about right. For about 3/4 of you, that's actually, if you were running things, you would actually have them paying much less of the share of the taxes than they were. So interesting. Okay, so that's our little kind of inequality poll. Another thing we need to look at is whether inequality has exploded or gotten a lot worse over time. So that's something you hear a lot about. If you Google the words exploding inequality, you get all of these hits from the popular press. Exploding inequality. Well, if you actually look at the data, I don't see that much evidence of exploding inequality. So over here on the left, this is from the Congressional Budget Office, which is a US government agency. And this is data that goes back to 1980. I showed a colleague these data once, and they said to me, did Trump revise all of the old data? I said, no, the data have been the same. It's the same. The Congressional Budget Office is a very independent organization, okay? They're not politically motivated. They don't go back and revise old data. So anyway, based on market income, this is one measure of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. That's kind of an economist sort of thing. Another great measure of income inequality is just the share, maybe easier to understand, just the share, the top 1% share of income. This, the solid line here is before taxes, and the dashed line is after taxes. So this is our kind of 15 to 20% number that we saw before. It's a bit of a different income definition. So what you see here is that income inequality based on pretty much any measure is not exploding. It may have increased a bit since the 1980s, although most of the increase actually happened during the 1990s, I would say. That's sort of the time when income inequality went up. And the other fact that emerges from this as well is that government policy has been pushing back against this a little bit. So like, let's look at these lines. This is the top 10%. So back in the late 80s, there wasn't that much of a difference between the pre-tax share and the after-tax share of income. The dashed line is after the government has gotten involved and starts doing a bunch of redistribution. Same thing with the 1%. But by the time we get to 2020, boy, there's a lot more redistribution going on. So the after-tax share of income of the top quantiles hasn't actually really increased that much because government policy has actually been getting much more redistributive over time. So inequality hasn't really gotten worse over time. I want to talk about a couple more things, and same thing in Israel as well. I want to talk about a couple more things before we end and go to some Q&A. Just one other thing. Another reason for government intervention I'll often hear of is something called the Keynesian Multiplier. This is John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so a sort of celebrity economist. By the way, if you want to look at another great thing that Russ Roberts has done, you should watch his rap video between Keynes and Hayek. He has a Keynes and Hayek rap video where they are explaining their different macroeconomic philosophies through a rap. It's actually very, very good. The Keynesian multiplier, the basic hypothesis of this, you might have heard of this before, is that government spending of, say, $1,000 would generate GDP of more than $1,000. So it's sort of by the government spending money, you're actually getting more economic activity than just the money the government spends. The idea being that if the government gives somebody $1,000, that person then spends that money. Maybe they spend it buying, buying a TV, and the manufacturer of the TV, if they're based in America, spends that money on some other things, and the people, or they pay their employees more, and those employees go out and they buy more food. So that's the idea of this multiplier. And there's a body of economic research that claims to find multipliers of 1 to 2 times during recession. So a 2x multiplier would be this notion that $1,000 of government spending would generate $2,000 of economic activity. It's just sort of this magical thing. The trouble is none of these studies are statistically actually really valid. What they're all doing is they're looking at times when there was a big downturn and the government decided to invest a lot of money. And then after that big downturn, there was an upturn afterwards. They have no way of controlling for the fact that maybe the upturn would have happened anyway. It might have just happened nonetheless, even if the government had done nothing. We don't really know. So this, during the Great Financial Crisis and during COVID, government intervention is often justified in the idea that if we don't do anything, then the economy won't recover. Then the economy recovers and they say, see, we did something. And that's why the economy recovered. Well, we don't really know why the economy recovered. It could have recovered because they did something, or maybe not. And there's no statistical way of actually disentangling those two things. There are problems with the Keynesian multiplier. There are big problems. One of the problems is that people are forward-looking. And so if people are forward-looking, then financing government with current taxes or current deficits will have the same effect on the economy. It doesn't matter whether the government borrows the money or taxes people to spend the money. So deficit spending can't actually create economic activity. Essentially, what happens, the question for Keynes is the following, right? The government issues a bunch of debt. They borrow money to spend $1,000, say. Okay, they give that money to people. The government gave people during COVID $1,400 checks, the US government. Just gave them money. Just here's money. In addition to all the unemployment benefits, they just gave them money. Okay, so what do the people do with that money? Well, the government thought, well, we hope that people will spend the money. They called them stimulus checks. The idea was to stimulate the economy. We're going to give them money to stimulate the economy. But it's not clear that's what people did with the money, right? So they didn't actually really go shopping. Evidence shows, and I'll show you the studies in a second, that people actually really saved the money, or they used it to pay down debt. And that basically they just kind of stayed home and watched Netflix. They, it was COVID, so there wasn't that much they could do with the money, but they didn't go out and spend the money. It wasn't stimulus money in any real way. They saved it. They used it to pay down debt, and GDP basically just would be unaffected if people acted this way. And indeed, studies of COVID show that this is pretty much what happened. Only 15% of recipients of COVID-19 stimulus checks reported that they spent their payments in the US. Most said they either saved it or they used it to pay down debt. They had credit card debt, we're just going to use it to pay it down. 57% of households in Israel, this is a great study by Naomi Feldman, who is at Hebrew University. 57% of households who received COVID grants in Israel mostly paid down debts or saved the funds. So much for the Keynesian multiplier. It doesn't seem like this, if you're not spending the money, then the multiplier can't work, because the whole idea behind the multiplier is people spend the money, and then the recipient of that money goes and spends that money on something else. So didn't really work that well, especially during COVID. So economists like me found it really disturbing that they called those things stimulus checks. So I'm just going to conclude. I had a bunch of other things, but I ran out of time. I'm just going to conclude. I'm going to skip ahead and just put up a brief conclusion slide to say, this is about what is the appropriate size of government. The government plays an important role in enforcing the rule of law, in creating a social safety net, providing public services where there are true dangers of market failures. But the questions that I hope I got you thinking about in this lecture were just how much of a heavy-handed government do you really need in order to ensure that the economy works well, in order to ensure that people have the protection of life, liberty, and property? How much do you really need? How much social spending and a social welfare net is really productive as opposed to not productive or discouraging of incentives to work? We want to have a society where work is valued, where people are rewarded for working, where they don't feel that if they work, they're going to lose a whole bunch of government benefits. So that's all those high marginal tax rates raised a lot of questions about that. And I also showed you that the idea of redistributing to address inequality is something that, well, you showed me that you actually believe there should be less redistribution to address inequality than the United States, for example, does. And the United States does a lot of redistribution to address inequality. And the question there is, how much inequality are you okay living with, and how much redistribution do you want to do? So hopefully we've gotten to think a little bit about those things. And my final remark is, if you have overreach and interference in the market, you're going to have large-scale inefficiencies and issues that threaten prosperity for the whole society. There was a great quote, here's the Leviathan wearing a mask, great quote by a journalist, Kevin Williamson, who said he thought that the coronavirus will be the Leviathan's enabler. Okay, that's kind of a mouthful, but he said the coronavirus will be the thing that allows people who believe there needs to be a really, really strong-handed government. It will allow those people, it will give them an excuse to say, see, we need a really, really strong-handed government because of the coronavirus. Coronavirus will be the Leviathan's enabler. He wrote that around April 2020, and I fear that in many ways some of the things that he predicted came true, and that he was right. So, okay, so let's open it up to questions.
Hey, it's okay, we'll go this way.
Go for it, yep.
Thank you so much. My first question is, I think looking into inequality is about fairness, and that, in my opinion at least, and I would like to hear your opinion about it, is that economy shouldn't be about fairness. If I'm able to produce $1 million of revenue and I would pay amount of tax, let's say 50% of tax, then I paid $500 million. And if someone else was able to produce 100 shekels or $100 and he paid 50%, he produced $50. So we have a huge inequality between us about what I earn and what he earns, and well, it's not fair. But I'm not Jeff Bezos. He was able to earn a national amount of money, and that is amazing. That brought a lot of money to the United States because his company and he's paying taxes. So why do we address inequality and not just the amount? Okay, how much I am paying an amount? There is a percentage, and that percentage represents the amount of money. He paid 50%, I paid 50%, maybe I'll pay a little less. Mm-hmm. Inequality is huge, but that's fine.
Yes.
So why do we address inequality as an issue and instead of an incentive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, another way of saying what you're saying is, okay, if Jeff Bezos earns $5 billion and I earn $500, he's going to, and there's a 50% tax rate, he's going to pay $2.5 billion in taxes. I'm going to pay $250 in taxes. That's, for many people, that's fair. I mean, he's paying, a massive multiple of what I'm paying in taxes in that example. You're asking a great question as well, which is why are we addressing inequality for the sake of inequality? And this also goes to the Russ Roberts lecture last time where, we saw that, even people who are lower down the income distribution in countries like the United States are way better off than people who lived decades ago. And so what is this notion, what is exactly the notion of fairness? People who want to redistribute, they say we shouldn't have as much inequality after tax, but I think the key is we also have to really consider incentives for innovation, incentives for business activity. If we're taxing people a lot who earn a lot of money, we can destroy those incentives. That'd be my thought about it.
Okay, just before we continue.
Well, you're asking, do I agree or disagree? I mean, are you proposing a flat tax?
I'm proposing tax proportionally. You would have your steps, like today you have in different countries, let's say.
Yep.
There's a limit to the amount.
Yep.
And there's a proportion. So if you're very poor,
yep,
you'll pay, 10%. If you're rich, you'll pay 30% of your income.
Okay, so you want progressive taxation?
No, well, I'm not looking at it as a distribution over the amount of money you made. There's a limit, there's steps.
Yes.
So if you reach the limit, that's great. So if I make $100, I'll pay $20. If I make $2,000, I'll pay, 30%. And from there, the sky's the limit. I will still pay my 30%.
Yes.
And my incentive is, okay, I will jump and I will jump and I will move on. And I've reached the ceiling, and that's amazing. Now I'll make more and more and more and more. There's enough.
Yeah, a ceiling on the margin. Well, there is a ceiling. We'll have to talk about this more at the break. There is a ceiling on the marginal tax rate that's set by the law of the tax brackets. There's a top bracket tax rate, and if you make more, you're still paying 30. If 30% is your top rate, you're still paying more. So I'm not sure I totally understand you'll have to talk later, and I'll understand it better.
Okay, just before we continue, please, guys, put your phones aside. And second, there are a lot of people that want to ask questions, so please don't put a speech. Keep it short.
They're just texting people telling all their friends that taxes are way higher than they thought they were.
I'm sure that's exactly it.
And that they want way less redistribution than there actually is in the economy.
Absolutely.
Okay, just kind of all right. Okay.
Who's next? Here.
Thank you. So it's a question about inflation. It seems there is a debate about the causes of inflation right now. Some says it's temporary causes regarding COVID spending. Do you think it's really true? And if not, what are the deep causes that lead to inflation? Also, specifically in Israel, there is the real estate crisis. And right now, the debate is centered around inflation, and we include the real estate crisis in it and the increases in real estate. But this is kind of an old problem in Israel. And are we confusing by not diverging the two issues and combining them together and thinking about inflation and real estate together?
Okay. All right, great question. So on inflation, I mean, we have a situation where labor supply, the amount of work that's being supplied by employees in the world's economies, has not recovered to the levels of pre-COVID. Meantime, demand has bounced back and has basically filled in all of the lost demand during COVID and more. And so we just have a major imbalance of of demand and labor supply. So I think there's really so given that, unless we can find ways of creating incentives for people to keep working, to work more, I think we're going to keep seeing more inflation. So I believe that it's kind of now fed into the labor market. Also, inflation expectations have increased a lot. One of the funny things about inflation is that people's expectation of what inflation is going to be often becomes what inflation is. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if everybody expects there's going to be 9% inflation, then I raise my prices when I sell something by 9%, and I expect my employer to pay me 9% more, and I negotiate with folks that way. So I think those two factors mean that we're going to have there can be bouts and ups and downs, but I think that we've entered into a new regime where there's going to be more inflation. On the real estate side, it's very interesting. I just think in both Israel and the United States, where in places where there are really, really big spikes in real estate prices, government is constraining supply. That's the bottom line. Government is constraining housing supply. California and Israel are actually quite similar in these regards. The constraints is done in slightly different ways, but in both places, through permitting especially, the government just does not give permits for big housing developments that are demanded by people and need to happen. So I kind of think it's a related issue, but I think that's very much about ensuring that the private economy for development of new residential real estate is working.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first regards VATs. I mean, VATs, especially in the countries where it's included in the price, it's usually referred to as the invisible tax because you don't see it. But it plays a huge role in the income of a state. So what's your position on VATs in general?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there reforms needed, or is it just fine the way it is? The second one regards fiscal reforms. Don't you think that the problem isn't really the percentage you pay, but the complexity of the fiscal system that makes it easier, for example, for some people to optimize their payments and for others not?
Yeah. So VAT, I'm not an expert on VAT in particular, because in the United States we don't have VAT exactly, so it's not part of my sort of ingrained as part of me as much as it is with others. What I will say is that the VAT is a consumption tax. And the economics behind taxation is very much focused on the idea of, where do you want to tax? What types of activities do you want to tax? At what point in the sort of production, consumption chain do you want to tax? And consumption taxation is thought of as being a more efficient type of taxation than, say, income taxation. So if a VAT, people often ask, well, should a VAT be introduced in the United States? Well, if it were going to replace income taxation, I would say yes, because the reason is that one of the worst things you can do in a society is have a tax system that discourages work, discourages production, discourages business activity. That's all bad, and income taxation does that. It discourages all of those things. The value-added tax is primarily a tax on consumption, and GDP consists of consumption, but also investment. And I think the balance you want the balance to be that you're favoring investment more, and so I would therefore prefer consumption-type taxation to income taxation. The problem is that most of the societies that have value-added tax also have really big income taxes as well. So I think that would be my answer on the value-added tax. Your other question was complexity. Yes, I do think complexity is a big problem, and it does favor the creation of a massive industry of tax accountants, tax lawyers, and lobbyists, which itself is an inefficiency. Sorry to the people who work those jobs, but it would be better if they were doing something else and the system were less complicated, because they're very, very smart people and they're very productive. I'm sure they would do great other things. So I would say yes, the complexity does introduce a lot of deadweight loss and possibly also raises fairness issues.
To continue that point, returning to the baker and the doctor, if I have to take into account when I lease an apartment the noise and the smell, because maybe a tanner will move in, and all these multitude of things that I need to take into account, and I also rent an office and so on, won't it become very, very inefficient and everything can be contested, and then you still need someone from the government to come in and arbitrate all the little details? In the friction of reality, as an example, it's compelling, but
yes,
realistically,
you need contracts to be able to be enforced, and contracts can get very, very complex. That's true. However, it does allow private bargaining between parties rather than the government imposing a regulation. And so while I think you have a point, another thing to consider is if the government's going to regulate this, then how is it going to be decided whether they're going to rule that the baker has got the right or whether they're going to rule that the doctor has got the right? I fear that it's going to be through various channels of political influence that may not be either, they may not be the most fair either. So no system is perfect. I would argue that the system of private contracts with strong legal enforcement would be the best. But it's clear that there are some costs to that. And even in the Coast presentation I gave, there is an asterisk next to it. It's certain, that there have to be relatively low transactions costs for it to all work well. And there may be situations where, I'm not a zero regulation person, but I do think that you have to think carefully about every regulation. Is this something that could be solved by private contracts?
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned creating a social safety net for those truly in need. And I wanted to ask, when the government only helps a certain percentage of the population, it needs to pay the price the market pays. So if we look at the health problem, you can see that in Israel, only 14 of the expenses are health expenses, but for the entire community, while in the United States, that's 22% because the government needs to pay the market prices, which are really high. So I want to ask what you think is the solution or the better option.
Okay, great point. Right. This is difficult. But one of the points you're making is that programs that are universal usually are going to get more sort of universal. You're going to get more public support for them. This is one of the reasons that in the United States, our Social Security pension system is universal, and it's done so in a way where even quite wealthy people get pretty decent pensions from the state. There's not really much. There's some means testing of Social Security, but not that much. And the defense of that is always, well, we need to give it to everybody because we need to have broad support for the program. Now, with health, it's done differently in the United States, where you have Medicare and Medicaid. These are only specific segments of the population, which is what you're getting at. I think that there's a related issue with very wealthy people getting Medicare benefits that really could be provided by a private market. So I see the role of government as being to make sure that they're providing basic benefits for people who need the benefits. And where you want to draw the line, what need actually is, what poverty actually is, those are sort of debatable questions. But generally that systems that are giving large government benefits to people who could do perfectly fine dealing with these issues in the private economy is wasteful, and it diminishes the incentives in the private economy. So despite the idea that public programs get more universal support when everybody's got them, I would still prefer only to target them. And I don't think the United States does a great job of targeting them, as I mentioned, but I don't think they should be universal.
Hey, first of all, thanks for this lecture. It was really interesting. You were speaking about the Ricardo's theory. I think it called like this in English. In Hebrew, we say Shkilut Ricardo, if someone knows.
Ricardian equivalence.
Ricardo theory about that when the government increase their expenses.
Yes.
So the civilians expected that the tax will be higher in the future.
Yes. Yes.
So you think this theory is absolutely eliminate the Keynes multiplier?
I don't think by itself it absolutely eliminates the Keynes multiplier. I think we saw during COVID that it eliminated a lot of it, based on the Israel study. I'd say 57%. The other part of it, and I didn't really have time to show this, is there are some other things that eliminate the Keynes multiplier. One of which is crowd out. So for those of you who have taken investment, when you have a supply of loanable funds, you have a supply curve for loanable funds and a demand curve for loanable funds. When the government's demand for loanable funds shifts out, you end up with higher interest rates and lower private activity. So I think that crowd out is a lot of the other piece of it. Another thing we didn't talk about that much that I think relates also to limits to, to Keynesian tax and spending is that, I mean, you do need to have the taxes. The taxes have to be raised at some point in the future. And the kind of Keynesian model assumes the taxes are not distortionary. But taxes are very distortionary. I didn't really get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which I'll just put it up here very quickly, which is the Laffer Curve. You know, the Laffer Curve shows a theoretical relationship between tax revenue and the tax rate. This is Laffer. Because Trump gave him the Presidential Medal of Honor, a lot of people assume that he must be a horrible person, which is, by the way, one of the worst assumptions you can ever make about anything is to assess a policy based on, or a person or something based on, who said it or who endorsed it, as opposed to just what the actual policy is. You got to actually look at a policy, and also don't assess it based on its intentions. Assess it based on its results. Those are some things that I hope you'll take with you. But the Laffer Curve says that there's a tax rate that would maximize tax revenue. And the idea, the main point is that as you tax more, you discourage a lot of work and a lot of activity. And so because Keynesianism eventually involves having to tax people, there are these costs of distortionary taxation that have to get paid later. By the way, I'm not a huge, the Laffer Curve also implies that there's a tax rate that maximizes government revenue. And a lot of economists spend a lot of time debating what's the tax rate that would maximize government revenue. And some people think it's really high. Some people like me think it's a lot lower. I think there's another problem, which is that we should really not be asking what's the tax rate that maximizes government revenue, but what's the tax system that optimizes prosperity in the economy. It's a very narrow goal, very governmental focused thing to say, what tax rate could we charge to maximize the revenue that we take in here? So while Laffer, I think, meant well in the sense of wanting to try to show that, hey, taxes shouldn't be as high as they are, he actually launched a debate that I think ended up being a little bit unproductive, because the real question is how much economic activity are we losing when we raise taxes so high as to get to the top of the Laffer. Top of the Laffer curve is a point where if the government raises the tax rate by 1 more percentage point, they're not going to raise any more revenue, because you're at a point where it's just tapped out. People are going to work less, consume less, because the rate's so high. I just think if we've gotten there, we've already destroyed so much potential for production and for prosperity. So that was a bit of a long answer, but I think those are the 2 other factors.
Hi. So I think I wanted to ask about the New Deal. I don't know if you have knowledge about it or data, but what happened before that? So the labor laws or the safety net, was it exist? People just starved? What happened before the New Deal? I think that's my question.
So I'm not a sort of poverty historian, but what I will say is that I do believe a society should have basic poverty protections. There should be basic protections. People should not be starving to death. What I would say, the point that I want to make, is that where we've gotten right now is a welfare state that is so large that we're not just stopping people from starving to death. We're not just stopping people from being homeless. We are creating a system where there are massive disincentives for work that are causing major societal problems. And we've also got a system where the welfare benefits that are accessible to people are going way too high into the income distribution. There's just no reason why people who are so high above the poverty line, as defined in various ways, should be getting so much in the way of benefits from the government-provided benefits that are ultimately being paid for through a lot of borrowing and things like that. So, so the answer to your question is, I would, based on my knowledge, I would probably say that the introduction of some of the anti-poverty programs in the New Deal was good and important. I don't think a society should have 0 anti-poverty programs. I don't really know what the anti-poverty programs were in place at the state level and at the local level before those programs. But I would say that we've just gone way, way over the edge in terms of the size of government intervention. I think Bob has a question back here.
Josh, could you also say something about the underground economy? Because I think that's also an important offshoot to excessive taxes and regulation.
Yes.
It's not just people not working.
Yeah.
It's people just escaping the official reporting.
Right. Pushes things into the...
So it's very hard to measure, but the last numbers I saw was that in the United States, the underground economy was around 8-9% of GDP. In Israel, it's something like 25% of GDP.
Wow.
And, and every time I've raised this issue here, I get ridiculous answers, which is who is escaping and how we need to hire more government agents to run after them, which is exactly what just happened in the United States.
Yes.
So,
right. Well, this is part of the motivation behind the Laffer Curve, actually, which is that if you lower taxes, you're going to bring more people from the informal economy, meaning the off-the-books economy, into the formal economy, and those people are going to be paying taxes. So that's a big piece of it. But surely, there are different measures of the size of the black market and of the informal economy, and I think that's absolutely a relevant thing. It's been very hard to do studies on this because we'd like to really know how much of the informal economy you're actually bringing into the formal economy for every percentage point of the tax rate. But given the fact that the informal economy is not measured, it's tough to get measurement on that thing. Another point you raised is just the point of tax avoidance and tax evasion. And the higher the tax rate, the more people are going to be willing to pay to try to get their taxable income not reported on their tax returns in various complicated ways, and that's also a big distortion.
Any other questions? This side.
Regarding the the Keynesian multiplier, you said that there may be a correlation between the increase in government spending in times of a crisis and the fact that after it the economy recovers, but it might not be because of the increase in government expense.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask why, and also we did learn in macroeconomics, introduction to microeconomics, that let's say in 2008 there was like the Obama care package that sort of was supposed to stimulate the market, and some economists do believe that it helped to do that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, your opinion about that and what should be done or should not be done.
The challenge is, statistically, it's impossible to know whether a single job was actually saved or created by the Recovery Act packages of the Great Financial Crisis or by COVID. Because, the economy might just be going in a cycle. We just simply don't know. The economy might have recovered anyway. We don't have the counterfactual. So statistically, it's just extremely difficult to make any kind of definitive statements. Look, I think that there is some role for the government, again, certainly an anti-poverty role. The idea that the government should smooth economic cycles, I think, is actually really a problematic one that leads to a lot of really bad incentives. People now know, based on the Great Financial Crisis and COVID, that if they take investment risk and it doesn't pay off, that the government is going to bail them out. The government bailed out the car companies. The government bailed out the banks. The government, bailed out the airlines in COVID. The government actually bailed out the government bailed out the entire business economy. And you can see that by the fact that in COVID, no investor who held on to their position, so the stock market went way down in March 2020. It had bounced all the way back up within a few months. So no investor who, as long as you didn't panic and sell, no investor lost anything. There were fewer bankruptcies in 2020 than there were in 2019. And some say, well, that's a great thing. We don't want bankruptcies. Well, actually, I actually think bankruptcies, particularly in the way they happen in the United States, can actually be a really good thing, because a bankruptcy means that the creditors who loaned money to the company become the new owners of the company. A bankruptcy means that the incumbent firms that have strong hold on the market, that they might fail and then new people come into the economy. So I think this idea that the government does, A, that they successfully smooth cycles, I think is statistically unproven, and B, I just don't think it's a good idea. We need to have a lot more in the way, it has to be that if people take business risks, that they bear some of the downside of that business risk. Otherwise, we just really have an economy that's just a crony capitalist economy. So I'm not a fan of those. I'll tell you a brief personal story, which I was working at the President's Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, D.C. when the COVID crisis began. I had gotten there in the fall of 2019. And I saw what was happening, which is that they were dusting off the old playbook from the global financial crisis. They said that, we're going to do a big expansion of unemployment insurance. People were talking about that, but nobody was really asking the economists what they thought it would do to the labor market. And they were also saying we need to bail out the airlines, and we need to have these enormous spending packages that are going to bail out the entire economy, and businesses are going to fail. We can't allow any businesses to fail. I said, you know what, you all can do that on your own. I'm going back to California. So I said I'm not going to be part of that because I didn't feel that anybody was going to listen to me, and they weren't listening to me. So I left. So I feel very strongly that the government should not be doing nearly as much smoothing over or attempting to smooth over economic cycles as they do.